Just after dawn, the Java Sea is ink black and seething, the radar painting violent red towers as AirAsia Flight 8501 climbs into the murk. The captain requests a left deviation and a higher altitude, but traffic and turbulence conspire to slow the answer. Minutes later, the Airbus surges skyward at a rate no one planned, alarms flash, and the frequency falls silent. It looks like weather claimed another victim, until investigators pry open the black boxes and find a more unsettling story. What really happens when a cockpit meets a wall of tropical thunderheads at 32,000 feet, and which decisions turn bad weather into catastrophe? This is the hidden anatomy of a storm, a system, and a crew on the edge. The Sunday after Christmas began quiet at Surabaya's Juanda International Airport. At the far end of the apron, an AirAsia Indonesia Airbus A320, tail number PKAXC, waited under a pewter sky, its red and white livery beating with warm drizzle. Flight QZ8501 was the airline's definition of routine, a 2-hour hop to Singapore, crewed by an experienced Indonesian captain and a French first officer, carrying families, students, and workers heading back after the holidays. The cabin filled with the low rituals of morning departures, overhead bins snapping shut, safety cards straightened, seatbelts clicked, as ramp workers cleared chocks and the engines spooled to a steady industrial purr. Routine, however, in this part of the world, never fully ignores the weather. Late December sits inside the monsoon window, when sea surface heat and converging winds over the Java Sea nourish columns of air that rise, cool, and burst into towering thunderheads. The meteorological charts that morning were familiar but unfriendly. Convective sigmets along the northbound route, cumulonimbus tops forecast above 45,000 feet, embedded cells likely, moderate to severe turbulence possible near the cores. In airline terms, it was flyable with deviations, the kind of day when crews request small nudges left or right of track and step climbs to get above the worst of it, relying on weather radar to read the sky's mood. Dispatch planning reflected that pragmatism. The filed cruise was flight level 320, 32,000 feet, with the expectation of climbing higher if available. An alternate airport briefed, extra fuel planned for weather and holdings. Inside the briefing room, the captain and first officer reviewed the day's NOTAMs, discussed the radar's tilt and gain settings for convective scanning, and noted the traffic picture on the corridor to Singapore, one of Southeast Asia's busiest. Nothing in the paperwork forced a delay. Nothing demanded a cancellation. For crews used to the tropics, these were threats to be managed, not showstoppers. Just after first light, the aircraft pushed and taxied toward the runway, the rain easing to a mist that flattened the horizon. On rotation, the A320 climbed cleanly, its nose lifting into striated cloud and diffuse sun, and the tower handed the flight to departure control, then onward to Jakarta Area Control Center. The cockpit settled into climb checks, standard calls, and the calibrated dance between pilot, automation, and air traffic. From the cabin, the view was an open water palette, slate sea, chalky cloud decks, belied by the glowing greens and yellows on the cockpit radar that began to stitch together a more complicated picture ahead. The Java Sea that morning was not characterized by one gigantic storm, but by lines and clusters, cells that pulsed and spread into anvils, gaps that looked navigable until they weren't. Crews learned to respect the outflow boundaries, the invisible gust fronts that can jolt an aircraft far from a storm's core. They also learned that early-day convection can be deceptive, already vigorous, even before noon. The captain and first officer would need tactical choices, minor course deviations, a request to climb to top weather, timing their moves among the steady stream of traffic funneling toward the Singapore FIR. Air traffic, for its part, was balancing those requests with separation standards in a saturated morning sky. From the ground, there was nothing remarkable to see. A departure time that barely raised an eyebrow, a climb to an initial cruise altitude that matched the flight plan, a northern track that hundreds of flights trace each week. Yet the ingredients for a harder morning were already in play. Energetic convection along the route, a busy airway that might not grant altitude changes on demand, and a cockpit that would need to juggle automation modes while peering into a radar's abstract of the world ahead. What followed would be captured in blips and timestamps. Secondary radar returns bending left. Radio calls for a higher block. Then, a sudden silence. In the next 50 minutes, those radar tracks and transmissions would chart a steady negotiation with the weather that ends abruptly off the screen. For nearly 50 minutes after liftoff, the story of QZ-8501 existed as a sequence of dots and clipped exchanges, each one ordinary on its own, together charting a flight that was thinking its way around a restless sky. Climbing through the low layers, the Airbus settled at its planned cruising altitude, flight level 320, and joined a northbound stream over the Java Sea. Jakarta Area Control watched it on scope alongside a familiar parade of morning traffic headed towards Singapore. In the cockpit, the crew's rhythm mirrored the airspace. Checklists, waypoints, a steady speed, and the luminous sweep of the weather radar painting obstacles ahead. Shortly after leveling, the first notable request came. The captain asked to deviate left of the airway to avoid buildups. Controllers approved a deviation of several miles, a standard accommodation in convective season, and instructed the crew to report when they could return to track. Almost in the same breath, the crew asked to climb to flight level 380, hoping to top the anvil shelves building in their path. The reply was cautious and procedural. Another aircraft was occupying higher airspace ahead. Maintain FL 320 for the moment. Stand by for higher. In a lane as crowded as the Surabaya-Singapore corridor, altitude changes are not a matter of willpower, but of spacing. Ground recordings and later investigative timelines show the Airbus easing left, then correcting toward the center line, a shallow dogleg that kept it clear of the green-yellow radar returns that, at tropical latitudes, can steepen to orange and red with little notice. The crew's transmissions were calm, the phrasing textbook. Outside the windshield, there would have been towering curtains of white and charcoal, the hallmark of young cumulonimbus growing by the minute. Inside the cockpit, the crew adjusted radar tilt to peer into the cells rather than under them, a small but crucial technique for reading the vertical structure of storms and the dangerous reflectivity gradients at their edges. The conversation with air traffic remained routine, if threaded. The request to climb was repeated. The controller acknowledged and explained the traffic picture, delaying the higher block. The aircraft continued left, of course, by a modest margin, consistent with a path that sought soft contours in a hard-edged sky. ADS-B feeds captured by commercial trackers later reflected this. Ground speed steady, altitude constant at FL 320. Track gently offset from the airway. Nothing about those numbers announced a crisis. They described a flight buying time and distance. As the route bent toward the waters near Belitung, that soft offset grew to something more deliberate. Several minutes before contact was lost, Jakarta cleared the aircraft to proceed on a defined heading away from the worst returns, still at FL 320. The climb request lingered. Controllers, juggling separation with northbound and crossing traffic in adjacent sectors, had not yet opened a clear vertical lane. This is the kind of friction pilots and controllers accept as the price of safe density. It's also the moment when a crew must choose between waiting for height or carving a path laterally through a weather maze that morphs with each radar sweep. Then, the rhythm broke. Around 0616 local time, the flight again sought a higher altitude. A minute later, the controller attempted to issue a revised clearance and got no immediate reply. On the scope, the target, still offset left, showed signs of a climb beyond its cleared level, rates increasing faster than typical for a heavy Airbus at cruise. Radio calls went out, QZ-8501 Jakarta, and came back to a quiet frequency. Within moments, the secondary radar return winked out, the data block disappearing into the sea of green phosphor and other flights. Whatever happened next would not be heard in real time, only reconstructed. Those last interactions left investigators with a time-stamped skeleton, a leftward edge around convective weather, a request to top rising cells, and a disappearance that followed a sudden, uncommanded-looking climb. To understand why the crew was pushing left and asking for sky they could not immediately have, we have to step back from the scope and into the atmosphere they were flying through, a monsoon engine churning moisture into towers, shear into surprises, and the airway into a labyrinth. Step back from the radar scope and the cockpit frequency, and the atmosphere over the Java Sea that morning reveals itself as a machine primed for trouble. December sits deep in Indonesia's wet season, when the monsoon drives warm, moisture-laden air off equatorial waters and the intertropical convergence zone sags south toward Java. Sea surface temperatures were near their seasonal peak, feeding parcels of air that rose explosively, cooled, and built into vertical towers. Indonesian forecasters at BMKG later described a belt of deep convection straddling the Surabaya-Singapore corridor, with satellite infrared imagery showing cloud tops punching well above 40,000 feet and overshooting domes flaring higher still. On the flight planning charts, convective sigmets stitched a warning line across the route, embedded storms, severe turbulence in and near the cells, and wind shear likely around their perimeters. This was not a single supercell you could skirt with a big swing of the yoke. It was a field of storms at different stages of life: young, cauliflowering towers, mature monsters with hard-edged anvils, decaying cells shedding rain into ragged curtains that together created a moving maze. In the tropics, even green returns on an aircraft's radar can hide aggression, because liquid water content is immense and updrafts can accelerate from benign to violent in minutes. Pilots talk about the way cells bloom around breakfast time. Watch a clear notch on one sweep, and by the next, it fills with orange and red, the radar's shorthand for trouble. Wind in the lower and mid-levels often runs in different directions, westerlies below, easterlies aloft in monsoon season, so the storms tilt and their anvils fan across airways, spreading regions of light precipitation and invisible ice crystals far downwind from the cores. The hazards multiply where those outflows meet. Gust fronts spill from under the anvils and curl along the sea, setting up horizontal shears that can jolt an airliner, raise or dump its lift, and send it hunting for pitch and power. Updrafts within a vigorous cumulonimbus can exceed 100 feet per second. Downdrafts slam down the same shafts a few miles away. Near the 30,000–38,000 foot band, where short-haul jets often cruise, the tops are not merely obstacles. They are ceilings that can be higher than the airplane's practical climb capability. On days like this, topping the weather can be a mirage. The tops keep growing, and what looks like a clean lane from a distance closes as you near it. Lateral avoidance is safer, but only if there is room to maneuver and time to pick a path that stays at least 20 miles from the nastiest returns. Inside the cockpit, the weather radar is both lifeline and liar. Its beam attenuates in heavy rain, creating false holes behind a wet wall. Scan too low and you paint ground clutter. Too high and you miss the worst of the vertical cores. Crews trained for the tropics learn to vary tilt with altitude, sweep the beam through multiple slices, and study gradients. The sharp edge, from green to red, that hints at the mountainous updraft walls best left untouched. The morning's convection was embedded, wrapped in mid and high-level cloud that muted visual cues. Without dramatic lightning or crisp storm outlines, the picture on the instrument panel carried the weight of judgment. Other flights in the region were making the same calculations. Airlines filed for altitudes in the low to mid-30s, then asked for more when the sky ahead turned ugly. Controllers worked those requests through sectors dense with northbound departures and regional crossings. Some crews threaded gaps and stayed low. Others were granted step climbs as traffic allowed. Reports from the day mention moderate turbulence in the vicinity of Belitung and scattered heavy rain shafts along the airway. Conditions entirely survivable when avoided, but punishing near the heart of the cells. Even away from the cores, the environment was a stress test. Rising fuel burn from detours, time spent in choppy air, and the constant management of automation in gusty, changing winds. For QZ8501, the geometry of this weather field mattered. A line of maturing cells angled across the route, with fresh convection igniting on its western flank and anvil blow-off shading the east. The A320's initial plan to climb to 38,000 feet would have cleared most mid-level buildups on a typical day, but the morning's overshooting tops were pushing the problem skyward. Leftward deviations could avoid the most reflective cores, yet drift the flight closer to the line's outflow boundary, rich in shear, poorer in smooth air. The safest path lay in a combination of both: lateral maneuvering with a quick step up, if available, to reduce time spent near the storm shelf. That "if" became crucial. In a saturated airway, altitude is a rationed commodity, and the window to climb can close as fast as a cell can build. The crew's requests to step higher were not outliers. They were part of the normal choreography of tropical flying. But granting them requires space, separation, and an opening in the vertical stack. As the weather hardened around the route and deviations grew, air traffic control's ability to clear a rapid climb became the next variable, one that would keep the Airbus longer at FL 320, hedging toward the storm line, and force a series of tactical decisions under tightening constraints. In the minutes after QZ8501 settled at flight level 320, the air traffic picture that mattered most was not just above the airplane, but ahead of it. Jakarta Area Control was working a busy northbound stream into the Singapore Flight Information Region, a morning cadence of departures that turns the Java Sea into a procession of data blocks climbing and crossing. Separation rules are simple and rigid: 1,000 feet vertically between aircraft in reduced vertical separation minimums airspace, at least 5 nautical miles laterally under radar control. When weather starts pushing airplanes off their center lines, those clean geometries begin to fray. Controllers are forced to build buffers, reroute flows, and hold altitude changes until gaps open. The result is friction measured in a few minutes here, a few miles there, imperceptible to passengers, consequential to crews trying to outrun a building sky. The A320's first request, to deviate left of track, was approved with limits, the standard compromise in convective season: keep me advised and report when ready to return. The second request, to climb from FL 320 to FL 380, ran into the wall of traffic. Another northbound flight was higher on the same corridor. A crossflow was transiting east-west. Any climb that early would have compressed vertical spacing and forced a cascade of reassignments. Controllers worked the tape, eyed their scopes, and told the crew to stand by for higher. It was not indifference. It was choreography under constraint, with everyone aware that altitude, once granted, would help the Airbus clear the tops that were steadily maturing ahead. On a day of scattered fair weather, such a delay is just a line in a logbook. In a convective field, every minute at a fixed level can narrow the lanes. The storms that morning were stratified in layers: rain-cooled air spreading under anvils at lower altitudes, violent cores punching into the mid-30s, and silky cirrus blow-off obscuring the visual cues pilots used to judge distance. At 32,000 feet, the Airbus was cruising along the shelf where updraft towers often intrude. The crew could see on their radar a route threading between returns. What they could not command on demand was the quick step to FL 380 that would shrink their exposure time to the line's outflow and shear. The technical tools on the ground were incremental, not omniscient. Jakarta's controllers had reliable surveillance of metal moving through their sectors, but their displays did not overlay real-time precipitation intensity as cockpit radars do. When a pilot asked to duck left to avoid a red cell, the controller had to take the report on faith and protect that deviation against other traffic. Multiply those zigzags by a dozen flights, and the vertical stack becomes the safest place to maintain order. In such periods, clearances tend to come in steps. Hold your level now. We'll offer FL 340 when the crossing clears. Expect higher near the boundary. It keeps airplanes apart. It can also keep them pinned to a storm shelf longer than any crew prefers. As QZ8501 edged left, the approved offset brought relief from the brightest returns, but put the jet nearer to the line's outflow boundary, where choppy air and shifting winds are a feature, not a bug. Turbulence reports from other aircraft trickled in, moderate in patches, heavy rain beneath some anvils, confirmations of what the Airbus's own sensors were feeling. The captain renewed the climb request. The answer remained: stand by. The controller offered a heading to reinforce the lateral deviation, a bridge through the most painted part of the sky, while they worked the vertical. Fuel calculations, time to go, and the moving mosaic on the weather radar all argued for height. The sector's traffic picture argued for patience. Height, on that morning, equaled margin. A climb to FL 380 would likely have put the Airbus above the strongest cores in that slice of the route, allowing the crew to widen their distance from the cells without penetrating the toothy gradients that ring them. But each denied or delayed step kept the airplane in the band, where wind shear begins to tug at indicated airspeed, and updrafts can add or subtract lift unnervingly fast. In the cockpit, the ride was turning busy. Auto thrust chasing small speed fluctuations, the autopilot trimming to hold altitude in uneven air, the weather radar's palette shifting with every sweep. None of it was unusual. All of it was additive. That additive effect is the hidden cost of traffic constraints in convective weather. Controllers must hold the line on separation. Pilots must make the best of the air they're given. Between those imperatives, exposure grows. More minutes near storm edges, more time in gusty corridors, more decisions to make as gaps close and reopen. The Airbus would eventually begin climbing without a firm vertical clearance, a move that coincided with its last transmissions and the start of a cascade in the cockpit that investigators later parsed frame by frame. What began as a delay imposed by traffic became a period crowded with tasks and choices, the prelude to a cockpit environment about to be complicated further by fault messages, choppy air, and shifting automation modes. By the time the Airbus leveled at FL 320, the cockpit had the hum of a routine cruise, tempered by the scrape of weather. Small jolts rippled through the airframe as the jet shouldered along the edge of convective outflow, the autothrust busy shaving and adding thrust to hold speed. The captain was flying. The first officer handled radios in the scrolling checklist culture of modern glass cockpits. Then a chime, amber on the electronic centralized aircraft monitor, and a line of text that had visited this airplane before: a rudder travel limiter system fault. According to the Indonesian accident report, PKAXC had logged a string of such messages in the weeks prior, often cleared by maintenance with resets on the ground. In a calm sky, the advisory is an irritant more than a threat, but in choppy air, with a climb blocked and weather thickening ahead, each caution diverts attention, asking for acknowledgement, cross-checks, and a plan. The A320 systems are designed to help crews manage noise like this. ECAM directs with short, crisp tasks, displaying the consequences of each fault and the aircraft's new limitations. But the airplane was not a simulator. It was riding a bumpy shelf of atmosphere, and the crew still had to parse radar returns, refine tilt and gain, confirm the offset heading, and step through the calls to Jakarta for a higher block. A few minutes after the first caution, another fault chimed. Recorded data show a series of messages linked to the flight augmentation computers, the boxes that, among other roles, manage the rudder limiter and add yaw damping and envelope cues in normal flight. The pilots faced a familiar decision in unfamiliar weather. Do they accept the degraded condition and carry on, or try to restore the system to a healthier state? Investigators concluded that the crew attempted the latter. In the absence of a checklist authorizing an in-flight reset, they went beyond the ECAM script and pulled circuit breakers to reboot one of the flight augmentation computers, an action Airbus guidance did not prescribe in cruise, and that airline procedures generally prohibit except under explicit direction. The move was not reckless so much as human, a desire to tidy up an errant system on a day when margin felt scarce. But pulling power from that architecture rippled outward. Yaw damping winked off, the rudder limiter logic paused, and the autopilot, which depends on a stable slate of inputs, let go with the distinctive disconnect tone. Auto thrust dropped out too. The jet that had been trimmed and guided by layers of automation returned, suddenly, to the pilot's hands. At any altitude, manual flight in light turbulence is a tactile job. At 32,000 feet in warm, unstable air, laced with vertical currents, it is exacting. Aerodynamic margins are thinner. The gap between efficient cruise and the buffet that precedes a stall is narrower than it feels over land on a clear day. The flight directors, deprived of steady reference, offered less reliable cues, and the standby horizon was there as the last simple truth in a noisy instrument panel. The captain pulled to arrest a slight sink as an updraft slackened, then corrected again as a gust nudged the nose. The first officer, head down with ATC and ECAM moments earlier, now had a second job: call out speed, watch pitch, and tame any drift that put the airplane nearer to the weather it was trying to sidestep. If the cockpit felt crowded, it's because the tasks were stacking. Call the controller back, update the lateral offset, scan the radar, reconcile the fault and its aftermath, restabilize speed without auto-thrust in air that wanted to give and take knots at will. The airframe shuddered lightly, the kind of tremor that makes pilots narrow their focus and squeeze the side stick a touch harder. In this environment, a small overcorrection can start an unhelpful trend. Climb a few hundred feet while chasing a smoother layer, bleed a few knots while holding the nose a fraction too high, let the visual horizon go gray behind the cockpit frame as cloud wraps around the windshield. The black boxes later captured a cockpit tone that shifted with the automation's retreat. Warnings competed for attention, some informational, some urgent, and the crew's division of labor blurred under pressure. The A320's protections, the software that shapes how control inputs translate to movements, that guards against the most egregious pitch and bank excursions, hinge on which computers are online. With the flight augmentation logic in flux, the aircraft's flight control law degraded, thinning the safety net at the very moment the pilots were doing more by hand. In a better moment, with clear air and time, they might have paused, re-engaged what they could, and reset their scan. Instead, the weather kept pressing. The altitude change still hadn't come, and the airplane began to respond more directly to every touch. The scene was set for a decisive turn. In choppy air, without the familiar cushions of automation and with flight envelope protections no longer guaranteed, an attempt to climb became something sharper than intended. The next seconds would reveal how quickly a high-altitude jet can move from stable to precarious when protections drop and the autopilot disengages, into a pitch-up and an upset that would test recognition and recovery. The moment the automation let go was not theatrical so much as abrupt. A chime, a flicker on the flight mode annunciator, and the unmistakable cavalry charge of the autopilot disconnect. In the same sweep of seconds, the flight control law degraded, FACs offline, protections no longer available, and the tidy scaffolding of normal law gave way to a more permissive regime. The flight directors, deprived of reliable references, dropped out. Auto-thrust disengaged. What had been a managed climb request became, in that instant, a manual airplane in restless air, heavy with tasks. High in the thin tropics, the margins are close. The A320 was skimming a layer laced with vertical currents, and the pitch bang of turbulence made the nose hunt. Without the autopilot quietly trimming away the bumps, the captain lifted the nose to check a sink and, by the data later recovered, kept pulling. It may have been instinct, a pilot's reflex to trade speed for altitude when the air goes soft, or a bid to get clear of the storm shelf that seemed to be rising to meet them. But with protections gone, there was no alpha guard to nudge the nose down as angle of attack crept toward the edge. The thrust levers, no longer married to a logic that would add power to preserve speed, stayed where human hands left them. Almost at once, the jet began to climb, briskly, then steeply. The VSI needle arced up. Indicated airspeed bled away, the usual consequence of a high-altitude pitch-up. The first buffet came light and ambiguous, the sort of shiver that in lesser air might be dismissed as chop. Oral warnings crowded in, autopilot off, flight control's alternate law, then the sharp synthetic cadence of the stall warning. On the voice recorder, the word stall would sound again and again. On the intercom, no one said it out loud. The crew was not indifferent. They were overloaded. The first officer, who had been head down with ECAM and ATC seconds before, now split his scan between pitch, roll, and an airspeed tape growing thin. The captain, wrestling a side stick that in alternate law responds directly to his command rather than through a cocoon of protections, kept the nose high, perhaps reading the climb as progress and the buffet as turbulence. The yaw damper's absence left the airplane a touch loose around the vertical axis, small rolls built into bigger ones. The dual-input oral sounded at times as both pilots tried to help. Airbus's way of saying two hands were speaking at once on a system designed for one voice at a time. No one asserted priority by pressing and holding the takeover button to silence the other stick. Outside, there was no horizon, only cloud, gray, and close. Inside, the attitude indicator told a stubborn truth. Pitch increasing, bank wandering, rate of climb more than the engines could comfortably sustain at that density altitude. The ECAM was still throwing consequences from the earlier resets, each message a gravity well for attention. Stall recovery in theory is simple. Nose down, wings level, add power. But in practice, it demands a clear mental model and deliberate action in the first beats of an upset. Here, familiarity with the stall warning competed with 1,000 hours of routine where the airplane, in normal law, refuses to let you fly into a full stall. That day, it would. The upset deepened. Angle of attack exceeded the threshold where wings lift more by faith than by physics. Roll control dulled. The elevator authority that had hoisted the nose now helped hold it there. The airplane reached for a sky that was no longer offering lift at the speed available. The stall warning did not relent. The noise in the cockpit, orals, checklist chimes, the thrum of air over a wing past its sweet spot, blurred the simple prescription. Even experienced crews can find themselves trapped in this narrow alley. An instrument picture that seems obvious in hindsight, but in the moment looks like a cluster of competing problems, none with a single clear fix. What happened next unfolded fast and, in the numbers, unmistakably. The flight data recorder would trace a profile few airliners survive, a rapid climb that starved the wing, a speed tape shrinking to a sliver, and an angle of attack that stayed high as altitude ran out. The stall, once entered, did not break cleanly. It kept the jet pinned as it fell. Those curves and timestamps, when laid bare, explain why the target winked off the controller's scope and never returned. What followed the disconnect was measurable in seconds and plotted later in tidy lines. The flight data recorder captured a clean break from cruise, a sharp increase in pitch, a climb rate that surged well beyond what an A320 typically musters at altitude, and an airspeed trace that began to thin almost immediately. The aircraft, still in alternate flight control law, responded faithfully to the nose-up command. Within moments, it was ascending thousands of feet per minute, the vertical speed indicator arcing upward as indicated airspeed bled away. The classic trade the atmosphere enforces when a jet points its nose too high in thin air. Investigators would calculate that the climb peaked rapidly, carrying the airplane from 32,000 feet toward the high 30s in a short burst. The numbers vary by snapshot, black box samples, radar updates, ADS-B logs. But the pattern is consistent, a rapid ascent at rates that spiked to levels more often associated with combat jets than commercial transports. The thrust setting did not save it. At that altitude and attitude, there was not enough excess power to sustain both climb and speed. As the angle of attack increased past the wing's critical threshold, the stall warning came alive. On the cockpit tape, it sounded again and again, a metronome the crew never tamed. The attitude picture turned paradoxical, as it often does in a high-altitude stall. Pitch remained markedly nose-up, 10 to 15 degrees at times, while the aircraft began to descend. Airspeed indications flirted with the lower edge of the tape. Roll excursions built. Without full yaw damping and with a wing deep in the stall, small lateral inputs translated into larger bank angles, the jet rocking left and right as the pilots tried to level the wings. The oral dual input alert chimed intermittently, a sign that both side sticks were active together, diluting each pilot's intent. At no point does the data show a sustained, decisive nose-down command of the sort that would have broken the stall cleanly. Altitude, meanwhile, was running out. The peak came near the requested flight level. Then gravity took over. The descent rate grew to 5 figures per minute in places, a number that appears almost abstract on a page, but in the cabin would have felt like weightlessness and vibration. Engine parameters, normal in the climb's first beat, were no panacea in the fall. Thrust adds energy, but without reducing angle of attack, it cannot restore lift. The airplane's configuration, clean, no flaps, gear up, offered no extra wing to work with. In alternate law, the protections that would have kept the nose from riding so high were absent. The stall remained fully developed. The cockpit data suggests awareness and effort, but not the right combination. Intermittent calls, warnings, and checklists crowded the soundtrack. The flight directors were not providing a coherent rescue vector. The captain's sustained aft inputs, the first officer's partial nose-down commands, and the airplane's degraded control laws formed a loop that never resolved. The stall warning continued for most of the event, briefly interrupted as the air data slid through validity gates, then resumed. Through it all, angle of attack stayed well beyond the critical range, elevated, persistent, the defining figure of the accident. When the target vanished from Jakarta's radar, the physics of those minutes explain why. The jet hit the water in a stalled attitude, still pitched up relative to the flight path. The wings never fully flying again after the initial upset. Later, sonar and remotely operated vehicles would find a fuselage in pieces and the black boxes intact on the seafloor. Their memory a spare, unsentimental narrative of a climb too steep, a speed too low, and a recovery that never came. Those solid-state traces set the bounds of the mystery. The next question is how decisions, training, maintenance, and cockpit design converged to make them possible.